right, well, thank you all so much for joining us for today's program, Interrogating Presidential Photos with the Ford Presidential Library. Since John F. Kennedy, most presidents have had an official photographer, resulting in a wealth of primary source material. But what can Americans of all ages learn by taking a deeper look past the subject matter and into the backgrounds and material culture represented in these photos? What will they learn? How can they learn more about how the lives of our leaders are presented? So this program is led by Dr. Richard Weld, who's the education specialist for the Gerald Ford Presidential Library and Museum. So everyone, let's give a big virtual round of applause to Richard for returning and giving us another presentation. And Richard, you can take it away. Thanks so much.
My pleasure. Thank you, Robert. And you can never say enough nice things about Friends of the Library organizations. They're fantastic. As Robert was saying, I am Richard Weld. I'm the education specialist here at the Gerald R. Ford Presidential Library and Museum. I'm coming to you today from beautiful Grand Rapids, Michigan, which was Gerald Ford's hometown. And so he wanted to have his museum here. For those of you who might not know, the National Archives is America's record keepers. We keep track of the country's documents from the Declaration of Independence to today. In addition to that, since Franklin Roosevelt left his papers to us back in, I think, 1939, we have created a presidential library for every president since. Even Herbert Hoover, who was the only other president alive at the time, who said, well, can I have one too, please? He's got one as well. So we have all of those presidential libraries and museums. Today's program is interactive, so please feel free to put questions in the Q&A and thoughts in the chat, and occasionally answers to my questions. Please keep those civil and on topic. And we're going to talk today about presidential photography and why it's different from your average regular photography. Our goals for today, we're going to learn a little bit about the history of photography itself, and then about presidential photography specifically. We're going to discuss traditional interrogation of an image, consider how material culture has changed during U.S. history, and then think about some deeper ways in which we have to interrogate presidential photographs because they're, as I said, different. And as always, of course, we'll have Q&A. And I love this quote, which is attributed to Ansel Adams, because I think it really sticks the question here of what do we see in photographs and how much of a critical eye do we think to use about them? So, first things first, we're going to talk about the history of some photography. And in this case, we're just going to go over a little timeline. So in the early 1800s, the first photographs are taken, but they required people to come in for sittings at studios, and they had to hold very still. If they moved, the image was ruined. Now, the images were captured at first on glass plates. Eventually, cameras were moved outside of studios, but the subject still had to hold still for minutes at a time. Try to take a picture of someone walking and you get a blur. In 1878, an improvement in the glass plate process allowed instantaneous capture of an image. Cameras became more portable and candid photos were born. Suddenly, a photographer could take a picture of a busy street, capturing all the people in a snap instead of just a series of smears. Now, at this point, those cameras were still just about as large as you see them in this picture on the upper right. Now, it wasn't until 1900, 20 years later, that Eastman Kodak introduced the Brownie, which you see pictured here, a truly handheld camera, which was about the size of a lunchbox. It utilized a roll of film, which meant that anyone could use it, and the snapshot was born. People took them on vacations, up in hot air balloons, and just everywhere. This was probably the turning point of photography for the people, but you still had to get the film developed. So there was additional cost even after you took the pictures. It wasn't until almost a century later, 1989, they'd had them in labs before, but the first portable digital camera was sold to the public. And I'm going to ask you, put your guess in the chat. How much do you think the first portable digital camera would cost a consumer on the open market? Just pop your answers in the chat. I see $3,000, $300, $600. I do play by prices right rules, though. So, you know, you win if you get closest without going over? I see 645, 100, 80, 250. All right, so far 3,000 is the closest without going over. The actual retail price originally was $20,000 for the first consumer available digital camera. Within a few years, though, your guesses were much more accurate. They were down to the size and price of a regular camera. So how many of you have a camera in your phone, right? Imagine how amazing that would have been for your great-great-grandparents, the notion of everyone wandering around with an amazing camera compared to what they had in their pocket at all times. I'm going to show you now a slightly spooky image. I don't want anyone to panic, but that is President John Quincy Adams, and I guarantee he wasn't as big a grump as he looks like in the photograph. Presidential photography got started fairly, well, kind of early. The first photograph of a president was taken right after his inauguration speech for President William Henry Harrison. Unfortunately, it's the only one that was taken of him, and it was a studio photograph. He sat down and got his picture taken on a glass plate. It was lost. Since he caught pneumonia at his inauguration and died, they never got a chance to take another one of William Henry Harrison. He was our 9th president. Now, John Quincy Adams, a couple years later, actually had his done in a studio. So he's the first chronological US president to have his photograph taken. Then, of course, photos were also taken of Andrew Jackson, our 7th president, and Martin Van Buren, our 8th president, before their deaths. So we have sort of 6, 7, 8 gap. And then every president from John Tyler, our 10th president, on, had at least a studio portrait taken, but many of them not much more than that until the technology developed, and so did publicity. Presidents went from having their pictures taken to having grown up with their own cameras. And then suddenly it went from reporters taking a lot of their photos and even film of the presidents. But most of the pictures of our presidents were taken of them or for them, not by them. It wasn't until 1961 when our 35th president, President Kennedy, finally created the post of official White House photographer. At that point, we're in, the 60s. Everybody can get access to a camera practically. And he decided he wanted to have a little more openness and a little more visibility, and he knew how to use the media. At the National Archives, we do a lot of interpretation of images and documents because that's our thing, is keeping documents. On our website, docsteach.org, we have a great source for materials and tools and stuff. One of the things we have here is how to analyze a photograph. And we ask the 5 W's. Who took this photograph? What was happening at the time in history this photo was taken? Where is it from? When is it from? And why was it taken? Those are a really good start on looking at most documents, right? But for presidential photographs, we already know most of those answers. And the photographs you see from the White House press office are intentionally created documents. So we have to go a little bit deeper, and we're going to look at some additional W's today. But first, I want to talk to you a little bit about the history of office stuff in America, what we call material culture. These are the everyday things you see in old pictures, but often don't think about. You should, though, because the differences between technology then and technology now make a huge difference for how you should think about these photographs specifically. So I'm going to go through some fun old photographs, and we can look at the things in them and talk about what the difference is in the material culture. So first one first, we're going to take a look at Jerry Ford, and it takes a second to load some of these photos because they're not small. There we go. What's Jerry doing here? He's doing his homework. He's going through books. He's reading magazines. This is when he was young Congressman Ford. He's keeping up on all current events, which you had to do with books and magazines because before computers and the internet, nothing was digital, no emails, no Wikipedia, and no tablets to keep everything on. What you had was a lot of paper. All right, now, bonus question for those of you in the audience. What is that thing sitting on the table just to Jerry's left? Not the lamp, the other thing. Go ahead and pop your answer in the chat. What the heck is that weird looking thing? Oh, somebody already got the right answer, and I want to see if anyone else can get. No, it's not a dictaphone. Good guess. Yeah, no, you've pretty much gotten it. It's a radio. That was a common way of getting the news back in the day. All right, so let's look at another picture. It's more paper. All of those letters coming to the congressman needed to be read and responded to. And that thing to the left of the lady in the photo, that's a typewriter. Now, a lot of students haven't seen one of these yet, and for most of those of us who aren't students anymore, it's been a little while. But with no computers, there were also no printers, and also no copiers until 1959. If you wanted to have 2 copies of a letter, you either typed it twice or used something called carbon paper. For those of you who don't remember carbon paper, you would take 2 sheets of paper and a sheet of carbon, basically between them, and then you would crank those into the typewriter, and then you would have to type and hit the keys very hard so that the key would hit the first page and put an A there, and then hit the carbon and press through that to put another little A on the next page of paper. This is how you made 2 copies of a letter, right? It's old, it's clunky, and it was really, really messy. But that's what it took in the day to have 2 copies of something printed at least. We'll get to photographs in a minute. Here's Jerry Ford again. A photo of your desk piled high with papers back in the day symbolized that you were working really, really hard. And he was a hardworking guy. And First Lady Betty Ford, back when she was in the White House, look at all that stuff on her desk. That shows, she's working hard. All right, a quiz for those of you who might not know. What is that strange thing she's holding up to her face? Go ahead and pop your answer in the chat, see if you know it. Especially if you're under 20. I want to know if you can actually guess this one. All right. Yep, a couple of people are getting it. It is an old style phone, the little cord going to the handset to the base. Somebody's saying it's a phone, but I'm over 60. So yes, you've seen them before. Note, she actually has another phone over on her other sideboard. She's really busy. She's got 2 phones. If those of you who are under 20 always wondered why there's a strange looking thing on your red or green button for using the phone on your cell phone, it's to simulate the shape of one of these handsets. So that's, a very big difference for material culture then and now. But then even if you're the president and you're somebody who has somebody who takes care of all your paperwork, you can have a clear desk, but you still have to make a lot of phone calls. We do have lots of pictures of Jerry's desk full of stuff. Honest. So what do these pictures show us? They show us that physical objects were how people communicated back in the day. And for every picture that was taken, a photograph, a physical copy had to be made in a lab and then given to someone. There was no way to send a copy of a picture to several hundred people or several thousand people just with a click of a button. Every picture was chosen very intentionally in the day when all of our media was much more physical. Also, back before computers, things weren't backed up. Film could get lost or damaged, and that's happened a lot in history where important moments where there was a photographer there were still erased, essentially. Mass communication back in the day was slower and harder, which means that a picture, which we say is worth 1,000 words, had to be chosen carefully. They still took tons of pictures, though nothing compared to what we can do now with the burst mode. But when they went to use a picture, they had to select them. And that's one of the things we're going to be talking about. So let's get into our W's here. I want to know when I see a presidential picture, who isn't in the picture? For every picture, you see a subject of the picture. And here's a great set we've got here at the Ford Museum. We've got Jerry and Betty teaching their dog Liberty how to swim. Oh, and I went too far. Liberty's not so sure about the water, but they're going to pull Liberty in, or maybe just lift her in. But once she's in the water, she does okay. We have these great pictures at the Ford Library. We even have a picture of Betty splashing Jerry with those bell bottoms, those really kicking heels. It was the 70s, and fashion was different then. But when you look at these photos, you have to ask yourself, are these a really true set of candid family snapshots? They're not really. They were taken at the president's official retreat, Camp David. So who's not in this picture? Well, the photographer, who was in fact a professional photographer who carried around dozens of rolls of film and multiple cameras and light meters and things like that. But also there are a couple Secret Service agents not there, any other of the president's staff who were standing around, they're not in the pictures. These look like great candid family snapshots, but they're not. It's not true that every presidential photo was staged, but they do only exist because a professional photographer was there to capture them. So who isn't in the picture is always a good question to ask yourself when looking at presidential photographers. All right, that's a who. How about a what? What are those people doing? And in the 70s, the White House did not have a pool. Jerry liked to swim laps. He liked to start his day with a swim. But instead of spending government money to put in a pool at the White House, he did a fundraising campaign. He didn't ask any taxpayer money. He just asked people to donate money. It wasn't until 1975, though he entered the presidency in 1974, that the pool was built. So on July 4th weekend, he got to go for a swim in the new White House pool. And there's Jerry doing laps. That's great. It's, again, kind of a chosen picture. But the other people who weren't there for the picture in the picture were there otherwise. And this is the White House press corps. It's tough to be the president sometimes. You just want to go for a morning swim and you've got like 50, 60 people taking photographs of you. So it's something to think of, that when the president is photographed, he knows he's being photographed. And that can also mean that he's on his best behavior. All right, so who are the people not in the photograph? What are those people doing? Well, they're taking the photograph, sure. Now, the funny thing is, this photograph was taken by the president's photograph of the press photographers taking pictures of the presidents. It's like one of those holding up a mirror to a mirror, and it only gets stranger because I think there's a photograph of the photographer taking a picture of the press, taking a picture. I'll stop there. All right. The other thing to think about with presidents and presidential photography especially is, where are the people who are in the photograph, especially in relation to the president? It's a question. When you look at a photograph, you don't necessarily think about where the people are standing and what that means, but where they're seated shows how close people are to the president. For example, this is a business meeting called by the president. They're sitting in the Oval Office. They're around the table, at the benches, at the couches, and on the big puffy chairs. That's nice. They're there to talk to him and probably listen to what he has to say. This is a photograph that was chosen to show these people are meeting to discuss serious business. Sometimes, though, you get the president with another famous person having their picture taken together. They both do this because they want to have people associate them with the other person in the picture. Now, this is Gerald Ford, who used to be a boxing coach, with world champion Muhammad Ali. So, they both had something to talk to about boxing, but really the photo was there to show the association between them. This, on the other hand, might look familiar. It's kind of like a classroom. These people all have their chairs facing the president's desk because he's in charge. He's talking to them. They're going to leave this meeting and do what he says. It's another way of conveying business is happening. Now, some people get to sit right next to the president. They're trusted counselors or friends. This is Secretary of State Henry Kissinger. But there are protocols and rules for where people sit or stand in the Oval Office, and position can show the power of that person and their relationship to the president. Photographs capture that placement and can help you see how people are getting treated. Of course, the true power in the Oval Office is being the dog. You can sit wherever you want, and you can even try to get Henry to rub your belly. Doesn't look like Kissinger's up for it, though. And then, all right, when and how was a photo released, if it ever was? We've talked about people who aren't in the picture, and now we're talking about people who are in it. This photograph came with a caption. At least one photographer, sometimes more, followed the president most of the day. They took sometimes hundreds of pictures a day. But out of those, each day, only a handful were ever chosen to be released. And so how did that work? Each roll of film was turned into a contact sheet, one sheet which showed little versions of all the pictures on that roll. When an image was needed, they would take the negative for that film, print it on photograph paper as many times as they needed, then physically deliver those photographs to the people who needed them. Remember, none of this was digital until the late 1980s. Some would be sent to publications such as individual magazines. Others would be used for posters or something like that. And still others would be given to newspaper services such as the Associated Press for wider distribution. And that's what you see here. A photo was paired with a caption and then distributed to any newspaper, magazine, radio station, or TV station who subscribed to the service. They could then use it for their news coverage. If you lived in California, Kansas, New York, Massachusetts, of course, you could see the same photos with the same captions in your newspapers all over the country. But until they were needed, these images existed as film in the White House press office archives on what is known as a contact sheet. That's another question, though. When and how was the photo released, if it ever was, because so many of them weren't? These contact sheets, by the way, look like this. We have a large collection of them. This one is from August 9th, 1974. It's President Ford's first day in office. As we said, from those sheets, individual images, the best of the best, were chosen for release by the White House press office. See how two of these are circled? Those are the ones who got used. These tend to be the ones where the president isn't blinking, frowning, sneezing, or so on. But that's because filters in Photoshop had not been invented yet. But as we saw, some images got released immediately. If there was an important meeting with a world leader, a couple of images might be released to the press right away. These pictures had immediate context, but many were stored for later use. A good picture of the president sitting in the Oval Office and smiling at the camera, like this one on the far right, could be pulled out later for a campaign button or a magazine article or just about anything. The vast majority of these photos, however, as you see on this contact sheet, were never released, never seen by the public. Most of them were never even printed. They only existed as negatives. Now, that's the funny thing about that, though, however, is that at the National Archives, we have them and you can access them. For example, at the Gerald R. Ford Presidential Museum, if you go to our website, you can see the contact sheets by individual day, and that will let you look up what was going on. You can also pair them with what's called the president's daily diary, and you can sort of stalk the president throughout the course of any given day. The daily diary is where he was minute by minute, hour by hour. And then you can say, okay, well, when he's in meeting with the liaison from the People's Republic of China, I want to see all the pictures. And you can. Most of the presidential libraries that are covered by the National Archives have these already up online. Some of them are a little easier to search than others, but a little poking at most websites will be able to dig up just about any of them. Because we keep these records and make them public, you have the ability to dig into them. That's really what we do at the National Archives. You can look at these presidential photographs, and for the most part, as you can see here, they'll tell you what was happening that day. So your basic who, what, where, when, and why are already answered. But asking the deeper questions, who isn't in the picture? What are the other people doing? Where are those people in the picture positioned? How and when was this photo released? And why this photo? Those will give you a deeper understanding of what presidential photographs were intended to tell you. It's not so much cynical as a critical eye, which is a very good social skill to have, especially when it comes down to looking at media. All righty, I've been talking for a little while now, so I'm going to give you a chance to ask questions. I do love a good Q&A, and I see that we have a couple of them.
So Richard, would you like to read the questions aloud? Just so you know, Richard, only you and I can see the questions and comments. The audience cannot. So
Well,
if you're going to read them as, yourself, make sure to read them out loud.
Sure. All righty. Actually, a couple of them are answers to questions I was already asking that just showed up here as opposed to the chat. Sorry about that. And let's see, what is that person holding in his hand to the left? I'm not sure which slide that was.
That was asked at 2:17, so about 10 minutes ago, Richard. If that's any help.
Let me see. That puts it down to a couple of different sets of slides it could be. Hold on. I think it might have been, and if that was your question, feel free to repeat it in the chat and tell us when we get to the slide. I'm thinking it was probably, and it takes me a minute to go back here because I got so many pictures and animations. Stalking a president through these archives. How often do you recommend doing so? With Betty Ford. Let's see. The picture with Betty. Hold on just a second. Let me get to it. I think it might be this page. Hold on just a second. Somebody also asked, I love the idea of stalking a president through these archives. How often do you recommend doing so? Well, you can only do this for past presidents, unfortunately, because when we get the presidential papers from a president when they leave office, it actually takes us a while to get them up there. Also, modern presidents, unfortunately, don't have contact sheets for us to go through and pair with the daily diaries anymore once everything went digital. So basically, you're looking about Kennedy through, I'm going to say Clinton. You really have great opportunities to go through and look at these things. So the picture with Betty Ford, you're saying there was somebody here to her left holding something? Actually, that is one of Betty's kids. I can't tell from the back if it's Steve or Jack, but I'm guessing he was on his way out to the tennis court. And I'm not sure what was in the bag, but not sure. Generally, it was a very sporty White House. They had the tennis courts, they had the pool. Jerry was a jock, so the whole family did all sorts of various sports. And then Laura, you were asking about what the person was holding to the left of Betty. I think this might be the slide we were talking about. Not sure, but I can't quite make out what it is he's holding. It does have strings, probably not a pocketbook, but you never know. He might have borrowed mom's purse or something. Other questions? These are great. You can pop them in the Q&A or pop them in the chat. I'm watching both. And somebody did point out that Ford also swam at his press secretary's pool. Jerry swam just about every chance he got. He had a meeting in Vladivostok, and we have a whole set of pictures with him swimming in a Soviet Union gymnasium pool, which has all of these really great murals of the heroes of the Soviet Union on the walls. And Jerry's just doing laps before he goes and has a meeting with Brezhnev. So, Jerry was, who is Ford pointing to in that picture? He's pointing to, in this case, whoever was talking to him. This being Congressman Ford in this picture, he did not yet have an official photographer. So this may have been a stage photo where he was trying to look very businesslike, and this may have been part of a newsletter or something. I'm guessing that was staged to make him look very businesslike.
Richard, can I ask you a question that's actually been being brought up in the news these last couple of weeks?
Sure.
And I'm not making any political statements with this question, but people are questioning whether it was the right decision for President Ford to pardon former President Nixon. I'm curious, what was his thought process, and did he ever have any regrets?
So, answering backwards first, no, he did not actively regret it, but his thought process was that he needed to get the country moved past that, because there were a large number of other crises at the time, the end of the Vietnam War, inflation that makes today's inflation look small, certain economic problems. The city of New York was going bankrupt. And he said, we need to get past this. And so the pardon was basically an attempt to move the country forward and get us back on the same page. When Jerry walked into the job, the United States was in the midst of a constitutional and economic crisis. By the end of his presidency, things had turned around quite a bit. He looked at himself as somebody who was there to fix some problems, and he had to pick the ones he could focus on.
So folks, yeah, no, that was a good answer, Richard. And so folks, any and all Gerald Ford questions are free,
Yes.
free game here. So fair game, I guess is the word I'm looking for. Fair game. Even if it's not about the presidential photography, but if you have any Jerry Ford questions, now's the time. It's not every day you're in front of the education specialist for the Gerald Ford Presidential Library and Museum. So, Richard, it looks like we have a few more questions in the chat.
Yes.
Or in the Q&A.
Yes. Stephen wants to know, since Jerry was an athlete and a football star, who and for what motive portrayed him as a klutz? Yeah, great question. Jerry Ford was an all-American athlete. He was offered a couple of different pro football jobs. He actually went on instead to coach boxing at Yale and be their assistant football coach. He swam, he played golf, he played tennis. He just played all the sports. He was on he hit a grand slam on the congressional baseball team. In his first year of presidency, he was walking down the stairs from Air Force One, which is a metal staircase, in the rain. He was holding Betty's arm and holding an umbrella for her and not holding the railing, which basic boo-boo. He slipped and fell down the last couple of stairs. This, of course, immediately made the nightly news. And this being the first season of Saturday Night Live, they needed something to poke fun of the news. And Chevy Chase started doing impersonations of Gerald Ford, falling over everything. Jerry, on the other hand, had a great sense of humor. His team actually sent a member, his press secretary, to be on Saturday Night Live with Chevy Chase playing Gerald R. Ford, tripping over things. And so he was portrayed as a klutz. He didn't greatly mind it because he wanted to have an open presidency. And we do have a picture, though, right after he left the Oval Office and we opened the museum, they had a conference here on humor in the presidency, to which he invited Chevy Chase, and they staged a photo of him tripping Chevy Chase. So he had a good sense of humor about it, but it was one of those humanizing things. Let's see. Michelle wants to know, some recent presidents have had their pictures that the official photographer took published in book form. Would that ever be done with older presidents using the contact sheets? It certainly could be. David Hume Kennerly, who was the Ford photographer you saw on the very first slide, has published a great book. It's a huge coffee table volume. I think it's currently out of print, but it's got great pictures in it, including one from that meeting in Vladivostok, where Jerry and all of his team had to go stand outside in the cold in the middle of the night to discuss things because their hotel rooms were bugged. So there's some great pictures in these books. Let's see. Larry wants to know, was it very hard on Jerry to see his wife battle with addiction? Yes, it was. But again, they lived their life in public and they believed in openness and honesty. So they were very open about these things. Why don't we get more positive press about what President Ford did? Jerry Ford made a lot of very unpopular decisions, and he knew it when he made them, and he didn't care. Jerry said, I'm going to do what is best for the country, not for my career. He was not elected to be president. He wasn't even elected to be vice president. I like to describe him as the president no one saw coming, not even him. He did not have any expectation when he came into the job that he was going to run for re-election. In fact, he was going to say early on in his presidency that he didn't intend to, but it was pointed out to him by his staff that that would actually make him a lame duck president with 2 years to go. So he didn't originally intend to run for re-election. So he made some unpopular decisions that he knew were going to cost him politically. He did an amnesty program for draft dodgers. He pardoned Nixon. And just, he did a couple of things that he knew were going to cost him big. The country was going through a lot, especially right after Nixon. Everyone was very critical of the presidency. He took the blows so that even if he didn't win a re-election, which he didn't, he would hand off the presidency to somebody in much better position, and the whole country in much better condition than when he got it, which was what he essentially did for Jimmy Carter, and they were good friends. Did any of his children get married while he was president? No, they didn't. Was President Ford ever on a U.S. postage stamp? Yes, he was. We have a giant poster of it here in the building. Any last minute questions? I do see someone saying actor Tim Robbins, Andy Dufresne could easily pass as young President Ford. Actually, young President Ford had terrific hair and was really, really, really fit. So actor Tim Robbins would have to do a lot of working out. We've got some real pictures of Jerry in his gridiron gear looking rough. So,
well, I'm happy to end on a Shawshank Redemption reference. But I think so. I think we've gone through all questions and comments. Folks, let's give Richard a big virtual round of applause for a great presentation. Feel free to let him know in the chat if you enjoyed this. I will be set. Richard, I'm going to circle back to you in case you have any last words for us. But folks, look for an email from me tomorrow with a link to this recording, a link to a feedback survey, and information about some other upcoming presidential history programs we have scheduled this summer. So Richard, we have folks in the chat saying very good presentation, wonderful presentation, a lot of thank yous. And Richard, do you have any last words for us before we wrap it up?
Very much my pleasure. I would just say have a wonderful day, everybody. And if you have a chance, go look at some of these photos and check out all the cool stuff.
All right. If you have any additional questions for Richard, I will include his email address in the follow-up email, and you can ask them one-on-one, because I know the minute I stop, we get 5 questions in the Q&A. So that's how it always
more popped in.
Yeah, that's how it is, Richard. We're going to let those sit there, though. I apologize. So thank you all so much, and I hope everyone enjoys the rest of their day. Thanks again, Richard.
Take care, everybody. Have a wonderful day.
Yeah, you too. Bye-bye.